in a sense, that Civil War was like a catalyst for moving LBT in the direction of more local ownership. And like I said, then I would say that put us probably 5 or 10 years ahead of most of the rest of the Bible translation world.
Welcome back to another episode of Essentially Translatable, brought to you by Lutheran Bible Translators. My name is Rich Rudowske, and I am your host today. We are going to dive into some content around our 60th anniversary. Lutheran Bible Translators had a organizational planning meeting on May 4th, 1964, and then was officially incorporated on May 13th, 1964, in North Hollywood, California. And we've been celebrating 60 years of the Lord's faithfulness. And there's a lot of great stories around Lutheran Bible Translators' history and founding that we talk about quite a bit. Dr. Morris Watkins and his family in Nigeria and that vision to get more Lutherans involved in local language Bible translation work. And what we want to look at today, though, is about midway through Lutheran Bible Translators' history in the 80s and early 90s. There was a civil war in the West African nation of Liberia, and then that eventually spilled over into Sierra Leone, too. And it happened to be that for the first 25 years or so of Lutheran Bible Translators ministry, quite a bit of the ministry focus and missionary sending had been to those two nations. So it was quite disruptive. And yet, as we look back today, we can see it as an important pivot point in Lutheran Bible Translators ministry and how we view ministry and partnerships and the importance of that, and how even we were and have remained sort of ahead of the curve of the thinking about how to best implement that and work through that. So what we're going to hear today is content from Alvina Federwitz, Jim Laesch, and David Federwitz, three folks involved in various ways in this founding of LIBTRALO. Alvina Federwitz and her husband Dale were longtime missionaries in Liberia and were there at the time of the Civil War and the evacuations and the founding of LIBTRALO. So we'll hear some of Alvina's on-the-ground experience. Jim Laesch and his family had also been resident missionaries in Liberia and had only recently returned from Liberia and actually had been at some of the very initial instability. They were still there in the country. Jim, at the time of some of these more cataclysmic events, was in administration as the program's director. And then David Federwitz, one of Alvina and Dale's sons, who's now the West Africa regional director for Lutheran Bible Translators, and as part of his works in Liberia, has some reflections from his perspective, both as a teenage high schooler, seeing what his parents were going through at that time, but also just reflecting as he thinks about his role today, how this really was an important pivot point in our history. So I'm going to walk you through that. The audio that you're going to hear is interviews that all three of these folks gave to Molly Poppy, who's on our writing staff. And this was just to create transcripts that they used for writing articles and some blogs and things like that. But there's so much great, rich content here that in the writing process sort of had to hit the cutting room floor, or you just don't get the same emotion of their voices through that process, that I wanted to share that somewhere with you guys and take a deep dive on this topic. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Real quick before we get there, just a reminder to subscribe to Essentially Translatable on whatever platform you listen to, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and just about any podcast platform now has Essentially Translatable on it. You can find it and subscribe there. We are also on Lutheran Bible Translators' YouTube channel. You can find a link to that by going to our brand new, absolutely beautiful website, lbt.org. And eventually you're going to want to scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, find that YouTube logo and click on it. And that'll take you to our YouTube page. You can subscribe there, and any content we drop, both podcast and video content, you'll get alerted to that stuff coming out. There's so much good content coming out, both the podcasts, but also video production, as we've had a lot of great events recently, vacations and visiting projects. So I'd recommend you go to YouTube and subscribe there. If you use Apple Podcast, we'd love it if you'd write a review of the podcast and share that. That helps with the algorithms and our podcast being available for others to share. And we'd certainly recommend, if you enjoy your experience with this podcast, that you share it from the platform that you're using. You can usually find a button that'll allow you to share it to your social media. Or if you are listening from a link that you received in an email from us, just forward that email to whoever you'd like to share it with. We greatly appreciate you sharing the Essentially Translatable podcast. So with no further ado, we are going to jump into today's content. So first we're going to hear from Alvina Federwitz, as she's just talking about being on the ground there in Liberia with some of these formative moments in LIBTRALO's beginning, but just the danger of the situation as well, and how the Lord walked with she and Dale and their family through that tenuous time.
That's kind of where we fit in. And I mean, my husband and I, we just saw that if we wanted this to go on, and then the war hit in 1980, and that was just the fertilizer that we needed to say, yes, it needs to be done from the country itself.
Wow. Like, you think that the war was what pushed it over. Like, the conversations had started before the war.
Oh, yes.
But
Oh,
then,
yes.
But then the war was actually what caused you to we need to move forward.
Right. I mean, the war took out our missionaries,
Yeah.
just like that. I mean, we were a team of 64 missionaries there. I mean,
Wow.
64 people there. And all of a sudden, we were all gone for a little bit. And then my husband and I were the first to return. And I mean, then we needed to depend on them.
When you were pulled from the country, did you stay in contact with the nationals at first, or was it not until after you returned to the country?
Well, we returned pretty soon thereafter.
Okay.
Yeah. We just wanted to go back and do a survey and see what was going on, and ended up staying. I guess God both my husband and I came from pretty simple farm backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
and we could live pretty much without all the creature comforts of life. And we just took every day as it came.
Wow.
I mean, we were basically the only missionaries that had come back, and we just took it day by day, realizing that if the heavy fighting really started, we'd have to leave again, but we never did. We just
Yeah.
stayed there.
Was it just really exciting to be building LIBTRALO at that time, or was it like nerve-wracking? What were the emotions that you had, that they had?
I don't know. I think it's much like, I mean, you are in that state now with your children.
Mm,
You're not exactly sure how they're all going to turn out, but you're going to do the best you can to make them what they're going to be as an adult.
mm,
And I think that's where we were. There were several times when we thought, okay, we're going to have to leave. I mean, we ended up not staying at the same place. We ended up being in different places at different times, because we had Operation Octopus, where they came in from 8 directions into Monrovia, and our life was, I mean, life or death situation. We had a couple of other missionaries there. We evacuated them. And then my husband and I weren't quite sure what was the next step, but there was somebody at the embassy that we knew who said, I'm required to leave. You can have my apartment. So we moved to the embassy, and that's just how the Lord operated. That's how we operated. Not that we were sitting there planning LIBTRALO. LIBTRALO evolved as a result of what was taking place, because it was obvious with the war that missionaries were not going to be coming back. And some did, and then ended up having to leave pretty suddenly. And we just kind of hung in there, and the Lord protected us. I mean, very clearly protected us a good number of times when we knew that he was watching over us, because there was several coups, several times when they tried to take over, and we knew that the Lord was watching out for us. I mean, we were walking from the office, which was around 6 or 7 miles from our home where we were living, and we met the rebels that were creating the coup, and we knew that we were probably going to be shot.
Wow.
And they walked by us like they didn't even see us.
Wow.
And I had this big bag. It was a Kenya bag. And as we were leaving the office, the Nationals stuck a bunch of stuff in there that they thought was important. And yet, they had their guns. They had them aimed ahead of them. And I remember my husband saying, well, I think we're going to be meeting the Lord today. And they just walked right past us.
Wow. Wow. I just think of that as that Isaiah where it says, and you will walk through fire and not be burned. Like that's just the first thing. I just imagine you walking with just the Lord surrounding you. And
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
incredible.
It is really amazing to reflect just how, they were able to walk through these dangerous situations, and clearly the Lord was providing for them, protecting them, whether just moving in the hearts of the people or making it so they couldn't see him. And you don't really know, but I think that is pretty amazing. And again, you just hear Alvina's heart, because it was on Dale's heart that this process of handing over and making sustainable Bible ministry become a reality, that it was on her heart too. And then again, as she says, the war sort of becomes a catalyst. Like now, while we've been thinking and kicking this idea around, we have no choice but to really lean into this. And I find that to be fascinating and very forward thinking on their part. Next, we're going to hear from Jim Laesch. Jim Laesch, again, at the time of the situation in Liberia in the mid-'80s and '90s, was an administrator here. And we don't get into this in the podcast or many of our published materials, but I can say, and Jim would say if he was talking to you about this, that this was a cataclysmic time. It turned out to be a pivotal moment in our history, but it was also a moment that nearly drove the organization into the ground, trying to figure out and pivot from all of this. And, the Lord's faithfulness, even through difficult times, is evident here. And so just listen to Jim's take on how these moments from an administrator point of view, trying to work these things out and what this looked like from his perspective.
So did that change those conversations and how everything was established with LIBTRALO? Did that kind of inform where LBT went from there and how things were like you said, there were things you would have changed and done differently, and I mean, obviously everyone feels that way when we look back, but as you went into new countries, did that inform how you established things there?
So I would say that actually happened in the early 1990s,
Okay.
where we made sort of shifts of perspective of having more indigenous participation, and that programs were based on a project model where LBT and LBT people didn't call all the shots.
Mhm.
And we strove to play our part and our role, and then to have the partnerships and so forth. So and already, like in Cameroon, when that country was opened for LBT, already that model was in use. So that was even in the 1980s.
Okay.
And so a partnership was between LBT and the Lutheran Church there. I would say later on, we then added, the Bible Society to be part of that also. And then, of course, with SIL, who had an office there. So every project always had this collaboration and a number of partners. David Federwitz can articulate that well, because when he went to Ghana as first LBT people there, and on a long-term basis, it was that same sort of model that we used in his partnership with, national organizations and institutions. So we did, and I always was a believer, whenever possible, not to sort of start our own organization or help start a LBT-Liberia or Bible Translation Liberia branch, but to actually strengthen existing organizations that shared vision and shared programs, and we could build and invest with that. So, work in partnership. In the early 1990s, we actually had a name for it. We called it the Indigenous Program Model, IPM, within LBT. I don't
So
know
many
if we'd use
acronyms.
Yeah, I don't know if we'd use those words today. We probably wouldn't.
Yeah.
We see it, but at that time, already that shift was being, made in how LBT did its work around the world. And so in Liberia, what did that mean? That meant in saying what do we believe the plans for the next year and budget for the next year was always done, not with what sort of the LBT missionary or consultant thought, but sitting down together with the people working in the program and the community and the partner organization to figure out what's possible and what's be done together. Very often those programs were only funded by LBT. There wasn't always a lot of other funding, although we did have a lot of joint projects with the Bible Society as well. Rightly or wrongly, one of the strategic tactical decisions I made, I would say it was a practical decision, was that translation project and their structure for planning and accountability, hiring people, publishing, and so forth. We made LBT participated with the National Bible Society, and language development and surveys and literacy in particular then was to be with LIBTRALO. Again, in hindsight, David Federwitz and I should have had a lot, and others should have all had more meetings and more discussions about all of that, rather than just kind of saying, okay, this is the way we do things. And I don't want to say that was purely that way, but more discussion could have been done. So I would say, some of those experiences where we look back and said, oh, we really should have talked this through more, have an impact with how LBT operates today. So that like when we went to Ghana or we went to Botswana, Southern Africa, and other countries, we would invest more heavily in what are these sort of pre-project planning and discussion and what roles people play and so forth. So that sort of preparation phase of a project is significant and important. Even though from an American point of view, like get in there and get what needs to be done. That needs to be done. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can build this bridge. Here, we can get this engineer. Let's get these guys over here to do it. We often think that we have the best approach and way to solve problems and bring technology and resources and money to do something. But if you jump in too quickly with a lot of those ideas, then the local initiative and ownership will sort of take a back seat and say, okay, they really want to do this themselves, or we'll let them do it. So this notion of, lots of community meetings and seeing where there's interest and trying to sort of fan that flame of interest, has a greater role, since those 1990s period of time.
All right. So there's Jim's perspective on things here. And again, you hear a theme developing that you come to realize that the right people are in the right place, and you start to shift your point of view and perspective about how to get things done. And in that vein, I want to take a quick excursus to another section of the interview with Jim and Molly that's kind of off topic, but it is interesting in terms of rewind a few years back to Jim's earlier years in the village and just how people perceived what was going to be happening with their language and how that still leads to some levels of suspicion and some difficulty, but also great opportunity today and the opportunity to really lean into local leadership as a way to say, no, there's nothing really suspicious going on here. But just to take a quick listen to Jim's take on how the economics of the time, and maybe still to this day in some areas, the economics of the current time, create some difficulties that genuine and authentic partnership can remedy.
So and very often we think, we as an LBT, have a perspective that, of course, everyone would like to have the Bible in their language, but that's not necessarily so. So let me tell you a story. Laura and I lived in the rainforest jungle, southeastern Liberia, and these places were people have lived and survived and thrived for generations and generations. Then all of a sudden, like the government comes through to build a road, and then logging companies come in to build a road. And so we lived there in the 1970s when logging companies then came in to harvest timber. And whenever you build roads, that's when civilization starts to change. People get more mobile and they're moving. And already people had walked for days to go down and work at the Firestone rubber plantation. And so these were all important parts of the economy, but they bring about change. And in Liberia, the common thinking about education was, if you want to advance, you want to learn English, you want to become literate, We want a good education and be civilized,
Mhm.
And so the indigenous languages were really seen, and I had many people tell me, they said, no, when we went to school, they told us that was the devil's language. You cannot speak that language. Children would get beaten and sent home if they spoke their language. And I've had many, many Liberian friends just describe this to me in very articulate terms. And so, not unlike in the United States here, Native Americans, their children were confiscated and taken and put into schools so they would be taught English and lose their Indian heritage, language, and culture.
Mhm.
And that's the viewpoint that it was seen. So in the past, 50 and especially 25 years and over time, these perspectives change. But when we lived in the village, 1975, and then it came time we were making that trip back to America, and then people would say, what are you going to do? You've been here learning our language and studying our language. How much will people pay you for it? Is thinking their mind was, I was there gathering the language and doing it so I could take it back to America and sell it. Now, why would they think that? The only other white people really who showed up there were people from logging companies and mining companies. And what do? They come to extract and to take and to sell.
Wow.
So why not?
Mhm.
Well, that's the frame of mind that people would have, automatically, unless you really made an effort to say, "Oh no, we're here, to be a blessing. This is to work with the church." And so that took years, really, to just help in lots of those discussions and demonstrations. And will there still be misunderstandings? Sure, there will be. You just have to try to talk through that. So even today, to put primary education in the local language in Liberia is still somewhat of a struggle.
So again, I really like that story framed in the framework of authentic partnership and creating space for dialogue and co-creative thought toward local program goals can help to alleviate some of this suspicion, can help to really build sustainability and create ownership and desired vision towards shared goals in the Bible translation movement. So we're going to wrap up by hearing from David Federwitz. David is Alvina's son. And again, as I mentioned at the outset here, he was in high school at the time of the Civil War and has some reflections on what things look like from there. And I just love Alvina, Jim, and David. Basically, I think in every one of the interviews, even the excerpts that we're going to share here, they all eventually refer to each other as the person that will know best about this. But, very close group of folks and really that recognition and the respect for each other. But David's going to tell things from his perspective and then really sort of, again, just walk us through how these are moments that are God moments, even when they look terrible. I mean, there's a scripture passage, of course, from Romans that we know that all things work for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes. And yet there are so many terrible things that happen in life. And sometimes you don't get the privilege to see how God keeps that promise. We can only know that he has or he will. But in this situation, with enough reflection, we can see, in spite of great suffering, and there are many people who suffered and even lost their lives in this war, the Lord was at work. And yeah, it's just really encouraging. So take a listen to David.
Okay, we've seen this with COVID, right? So like COVID comes, disrupts everything. Look at all the churches that are having online services now. Okay, you can look at that and say, wow, people aren't coming to church. And that's sad. But then you also look at it and say, there's a lot more opportunity for people to go to church, which is great, So there, sometimes what we look at as, even Joseph said to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God, used for good, or what you
Yes.
intended for evil, God used for good. And sometimes we can look at that in a situation that we're going through, whether it's civil war, whether it's COVID, whether it's, even that our pastor takes a call, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, this is like the worst thing ever. but God has a way, because he's a redeeming God and he's a regenerating, like he's a God of regenerate. He just has a way of taking those things that are just terrible
Mhm.
and working them into good. And sometimes we as people don't have patience to wait for God to do that. And sometimes God surprises us with how quickly it happens. And sometimes God surprises us with how slow he is,
Yeah.
so you just don't know.
Yeah, no, it's true. And God can do so much, and we limit him when we think,
Yeah.
oh, this civil war, I guess we can't work in this country anymore. But instead, God put the right people there, obviously, through
That's
your
right.
parents and Jim and everything like that, who had their eyes
Yeah.
open.
And then the Liberians who were there who made it
Yeah.
work. And then you get the Liberians who stood on the board who during, in the middle of the Civil War, they're creating an organization, right? And they
That's amazing.
they don't know what tomorrow's going to hold. They may have to run out of their houses with the clothes on their back, but yet they're forming an organization.
Yeah, that is true. That is incredible to think about.
Yeah.
Just really amazing what God did there, and the people he knew were going to be there at that time or placed there and living there. And yeah, so very cool.
I would not have thought about this unless you asked the question. And that is because of what happened in Liberia with the Civil War and with kind of birthing LIBTRALO, LBT was ahead of the curve,
Mhm.
I would say, of almost all the Bible translation agencies, in the sense of all of a sudden, in just that, I would say, a short period of time, recognizing that our expatriate missionaries were on the sideline. They were all out. They were all in the United States, speaking at their churches, raising support, but essentially on the sidelines. They could not get back to Liberia.
Mhm.
So what that did is it made those missionaries who had linkages back to people in Liberia, in the language community. Now, keep in mind, this was before cell phones. Email was just barely a thing. Okay, this is back when you would check email once a week because you're not getting that many messages. It didn't really matter.
Yeah.
And so and then mail, you have written letters, but that would take forever. And then with the Civil War, the post office was closed down and everything. So it was hard for the missionaries sitting on the sidelines to communicate with people in Liberia. But in as much as they were able to communicate with people in Liberia, they were relying on those people in Liberia, in those language communities. So a lot of times, you can ask my mom about this, actually. A lot of times my parents became sort of the link or the conduit. So my parents had email.
Mhm.
So missionaries who were in the United States, let's say a missionary who was, I'm just going to make this up. Let's say a missionary who was assigned to the Kron people, doing Bible translation for the Quran or literacy for the Quran, they're in the United States. They can't go to Liberia, but mom and dad are there. Okay. For most of the Civil War, mom and dad were there. And so they would send an email. Mom and dad would get the email, but it's not an email to mom and dad. It's an email to whoever was in the Quran, Quran.
Yeah.
So mom and
Yeah.
dad would print that out almost like a letter, print
Mhm.
it out, give it to that Quran person. The Quran person would basically do their work assignment that they were given by the missionary, right? Or elicit data and send it back to the missionary. Again, using that same like backwards channel, giving it to my parents. Mom would
Mhm.
type it up, send it as an email. Okay. So what happened is LBT started realizing the importance of working with, we always were working with indigenous people, but we were doing it kind of our own way. But when you have to work through somebody else, you start doing
Yeah.
it their way.
Their
And then,
way.
and so, it was clunky at first, but in a way you streamline the process. First, it's kind of, I would say, missionary driven questions, work assignments, those kinds of things. But then as time goes on, those Liberians who are working in their community, they're starting to say, oh, what if we did this? What if we did that? And they're talking to my mom and dad and saying, what if we did this? And all of a sudden they start getting involved in a way that almost in a decision making or in a strategy kind of way can we link this up with some relief work or something like that? And so
Yeah.
in a sense, that Civil War was like a catalyst for moving LBT in the direction of more local ownership. And like I said, then I would say that put us probably 5 or 10 years ahead of most of the rest of the Bible translation world, most of the Bible translation agencies, and saying, okay, how do we foster better local ownership? Because we see that the local ownership is key. What do you guys have at the table already? Or what can you bring to the table? How can we work together? Rather than this is, LBT, we're just coming in, we're doing it, and, we're going to pay you to work alongside us, but we're doing it and you can help us. Versus this is what you're doing. Now LBT will come in and help you accomplish what you want. To the point where when Valerie and I went to Ghana and we were together with Nathan and Sarah Estola, so I think you knew that. So Estola and us, we worked together in Ghana. That partnership was different than how LBT had worked before that. In that partnership, our LBT's primary partner was the Lutheran Church of Ghana.
Yeah.
But then we also worked with the Bible Society of Ghana, and we worked with the Komba community. And so we have an agreement, an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. It's a 4-way MOU. Okay. LBT, Bible Society, ELCG, and Kwalibi-Trap. So those 4 coming together. That I don't think that would have happened had the Civil War in Liberia not happened, if it had not changed the way we in LBT think.
Yeah, just amazing to see the Lord's hand to put things that are really difficult and problematic in the framework of the Lord is at work. I can trust that the Lord's at work, even when I can't see it. And like David said, sometimes it happens really fast, and sometimes it happens a lot slower than you'd want. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that God's at work, and we don't really want to wait for that. And yet the Lord is faithful in all. And so I hope you've been encouraged by this episode here, and just a look that we haven't really explored much in our conversations about our own history in Lutheran Bible Translators, but the real pivotal moment that exists because of the Liberian Civil War and faithful leaders who had the vision to know God still called us into a mission. God's still asking us to be at work in this, and we're going to lean into how best to do that. That really forms an important part of our ethos to this day, how we approach partnership, how we view the importance of community engagement, co-creative planning and processing, how we believe the Lord is leading us to be aligned with local communities and the church as we move forward into the next generation of Bible ministry. And LIBTRALO is not just a feature of the past. We are currently still in partnership with the Liberian Translation and Literacy Organization. You can find out about our work with them by going to our website at lbt.org. and navigating to the programs page, or you can type directly in lbt.org/Liberia-translation. That's Liberia-translation. Thanks for listening, everyone. God bless. Thank you for listening to the Essentially Translatable podcast, brought to you by Lutheran Bible Translators. You can find past episodes of the podcast at lbt.org/podcast, or subscribe on Audible, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow Lutheran Bible Translators' social media channels on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or go to lbt.org to find out how you can get involved in the Bible translation movement and put God's Word in their hands. The Essentially Translatable podcast is edited and produced by Audrey Sider. Artwork designed by Sarah Rudowske. Music written and performed by Rob Veit. I'm Rich Rudowske. So long for now.